So just so we get a sense of who's in the room, I'm going to ask you if you kind of fall into each of those buckets, either kind of scientific or academic, nonprofit-y, or commercial. So first, raise of hands, who would consider themselves scientific or academic? All right, most people there. Nonprofit? Got a few other ones, maybe some of the same hands. And then who would be considered commercial on that side? All right, we got a couple, so that's good. So I want to leave time for people to have active conversations around this. So I'll keep my remarks short, but I want to welcome up Tim McPherson at the Urban Systems School. He'll be speaking around some air quality and other issues. And as a fun random fact for him, he has a small farm at home, where these are my words, not his. I believe it was a collection of children, chickens, bees, and bunnies, right? There you go. Come on up. You get a clicker if you want it, or you can use the laptop.
Great.
Good. And I'll nudge you on timing.
That's all of us. Okay, thanks so much, Brian. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm Timon McPherson. I direct the Urban Systems Lab at the New School, and I'm going to talk to you about a new effort, ClimateIQ, recently funded by Google.org. Just 2 weeks ago, New York City looked like this. This is Park Slope, Brooklyn. This was the most rainfall ever recorded in the history of New York City in a 24-hour period. What's interesting about this is that just 2 years ago, we broke the rainfall record for the most rain ever recorded in a single hour during Hurricane Ida. Right before that, just days before that, that record had been set by Hurricane Henri. Now, that's just flooding. 3 months ago in New York City, we broke our air pollution records for having the worst air quality in the world for a couple days, which is not normal. This is driven by the Canadian wildfires. I'm trying to make 2 points here. One is that the way most people experience climate change is through climate-driven extreme events. This is how we actually experience climate change as people. The second is that these kinds of events are becoming more frequent. They're becoming more frequent, they're becoming more intense, and they're having more impact. What that means is that the winter storms, the tropical storms, the heat waves, the coastal flooding, things driven by sea level rise, these are all having more and more impact. That means impact on our people, on our economies, and our infrastructure. In just the first 11 days of September, we had 8 global catastrophic floods around the world. So one of the things that we just kind of have to realize here is that the adaptation challenge is a massive challenge. Second kind of point on that is that the costs of this are rising very rapidly. I don't know if you're keeping up on sort of what's happening here in just the US context, but we've had 24 natural disasters, all driven by storms in the US just this year. Each of those exceeded $1 billion in damage. So the costs are rising. In fact, if you look back to 1980, just in the US alone, we've lost, in terms of economic losses from these kinds of climate-fueled extreme events, $2.6 trillion in losses. That's just the United States. That's not the global context. The global context, of course, is much higher. I worked on the IPCC as a lead author for the Urban Adaptation chapter. Out of the thousands and thousands of pages that we released in our reports last year, I want to give you 3 points, just 3 highlights from this. Here's the first one. These are things you probably know, but I'm getting to something that I want you to really kind of pick up on. Climate change is a threat multiplier, right? We already have a lot of challenges. We already have food, energy, water security, all of these challenges, but climate change makes them worse. That's point 1. The second is that the impacts on people and infrastructure and economies is going to be largest in cities. Why is that? Because urban areas are where we concentrate all of that. They're the economic engine of the planet, right? 80% of our economy is driven out of the urban context. It's where we concentrate people. The growth is expanding really rapidly in cities, and it's where we concentrate infrastructure. Related to this, though, is and also coming out of the IPCC, is that the vulnerable folks are going to be the ones who bear the brunt of the climate extremes. So focusing our adaptation and resilience efforts on the vulnerable is really priority number 1. The third point I want to make, and this is, to me, the most sobering out of all 3 working groups across the IPCC and all the reports, is that the next 20 to 30 years of climate change are built into the climate system. So what that means is that no matter how fast we deeply decarbonize our economy across every kind of sector, it's going to take us decades to be able to slow the acceleration of climate impacts on cities and connected and other systems, right? So the adaptation gap that we need to close is frankly massive. I know this is not the most exciting and fun thing to be hearing right after lunch, but I'm trying to set a context here about what is the challenge that we really have to take on a grand global scale. This is the number, though, of how much finance is focused on adaptation. The majority of all of our efforts, and it's taken us decades to get there, is focused on mitigation, right? Really rapidly thinking about how to go through an energy transition, how to move our economy in a way that is decarbonized as much as possible. And yet, the challenges that I just showed you are ones we're facing now and that are accelerating and likely to get much worse in especially the next couple decades. So this is not enough. The point being here that if we are going to actually take on what I like to call a moonshot challenge of closing the adaptation gap on this planet, we're going to have to get aggressive, we're going to have to get serious, and we're going to have to scale up this finance in a really dramatic way. Now, places like New York City, where I'm from, based downtown in Manhattan, woke up to some of these events recently. So when Hurricane Harvey struck Houston and caused all that devastation, we realized in New York City that we just don't know enough about how rainfall, extreme rainfall in particular, might affect our city. So even though I just showed you all those impacts we've been having over the last couple years, in 2017 is when we actually started to get serious about this. So New York City launched a project that was intended to help us understand and really provide the most advanced technology, the most advanced data to provide information so we can plan and prioritize investments to protect the vulnerable in New York City. How do we do this? Well, we launched a multi-million-dollar project to develop hydrological models where we could run multiple types of scenarios and deliver that information to the city to say, here are the places that are going to flood the most. This is where the flood extent is going to be the most dramatic and the most deep, and how long that water is going to stay there. That's just for flooding. This is a project I co-led. This is an example of how well-resourced cities like New York can access that amazing technology and that data, right? With high spatial specificity. In 2021, we put out the first ever plan of its kind, the Stormwater Resiliency Plan for New York City, based on this kind of advanced modeling, advanced sort of data integration. This is not something that most cities around the world have access to. In fact, it's pretty rare for cities to have access to this. This kind of data-rich information that you can see in New York is something that 5,000 cities and towns in the United States don't have. It's something that almost 2 million cities, towns, and urban areas around the world do not have access to. So the real question here is, how are we going to protect the billions of people in urban areas, especially that expansion and that expanded urban development, in a way that can make sure that new development is climate resilient development? They need tools like these. So what I want you to imagine here is, what if the next 2 billion people moving and living and growing up in cities, as we expand urbanization around the planet, what if all of that infrastructure development was climate resilient development? What if the estimated $90 trillion in infrastructure that needs to be spent to accommodate the growing population on the planet was climate resilient infrastructure, which is what the IPCC called for? That's the goal here. How are we going to get there? Well, we're going to need to be able to prioritize an infrastructure in a way that can protect the most vulnerable where they live. And that's going to require advanced data and technology, in addition to infrastructure and institutional investments and other kinds of transformative climate governance. So our question here really is, what can we do about it? And this is where I want to introduce you to a new project. This is the one that we've been mentioning all week. That's a recent project funded by Google.org, which we're really grateful for, to advance the ability for cities all around the world to have access to the same kinds of information that we have in places like New York City or London or Miami, these front-runner cities that have resources that most of the other cities don't have access to. What is ClimateIQ? It's an AI-driven climate risk assessment tool that's intended to provide next-generation information for cities all around the world. And our goals are really simple, actually. Create these tools. We'll be leveraging Google Earth Engine, Colab's, cloud computing, all the things that are going to be required, as you all well know, to really be able to provide next generation information that can pinpoint areas to prioritize investments where they're needed most and protect the most vulnerable. The second is the one I've been alluding to the whole way through here, which is democratizing access. We're committed to making this open access and available for everyone, and that's key because that access is currently what's holding back decision making in a way that can be prioritized. Even if we unlock the finance, which is a major problem, right, globally, even if we can unlock that finance and increase that by orders of magnitude for adaptation, it's still going to end up being limited and going to need to be prioritized in the areas that can have the most impact. So that's what we're all about at ClimateIQ, trying to inform planning, help prioritize decisions, and unlock finance in those areas. Who is it for? Well, it's for cities and town planners. Obviously, that's how we're focused on, people who are making decisions, but it's not just city agencies, it's not just national governments, it's also communities who are making their own adaptation plans, who have their own information about what's needed in their communities to really address the climate challenge that they're facing. So here you can see a little bit of a demo of the dashboard that we're working to make this open access and available for everyone. And this is the kind of platform that we'll feed these kind of data inputs into with lots of other partners. I got my 1-minute warning. You're probably wondering, is this really feasible? This sounds like a little bit of an ambitious project to try to address flooding and air pollution and heat simultaneously. We think we can do it. The way we're going to do it is we're going to leverage information from cities of lots of different types, cities in different climate contexts, old cities, newer cities, small cities, and large cities all around the world, cities where we have data, and use that to train a machine learning approach that can learn from the outputs of hydrological models, the output of our atmospheric weather models and others, and then be able to provide that in a more generalizable format for cities all around the world. We're at early stages. This is a bit of a stay tuned kind of talk today, but we're pretty excited to be able to announce this. We're going to need a lot of smart people on board to make this happen. We're excited that we have a number of amazing partners, both private sector like ClimateSense, academics, and other folks that we're engaging with. The city of New York has come on as an early partner. We're talking to other cities around the world about coming on as users who can have early access to these products and help us test and validate. A key piece of this will be validation of the outputs and really looking at other kinds of extent databases in terms of heat extents or flood extents, when and where they occur. So I'd invite you to stay tuned, pay attention if you're interested to either websites or on social media as we're starting to gear this project up. We're launching also with support from Google Fellows to bring on other engineers and data scientists to help build this product out. And we're hoping that next year we'll have a real proof of concept that we can show you how this is actually being used by cities. Thanks so much.
Any questions from the audience on that? Come on, it was a pretty cool presentation, had lots of 3D fly-throughs. Yes, we have Mike's coming right to you.
Thank you, Timon. It's an exciting project. I noticed that you focus your ClimateIQ on municipality, government, and people from community. Do you think also journalists and people from media could take advantage of a platform like that to help put some pressure to have these measures and adaptation done?
It's a great idea. I love it. The idea here is that the platform that we're building where we'll be delivering all of these outputs that are sort of first initiated within the Google environment is one that will be free and that will be open. Obviously, there's other things that we can do with our partners. We'll be looking at things like real-time weather-related risks that can give forecast out. Those are very hard to give away for free because you're actually querying and pulling data in real time. But the goal of this is to be able to do that, and then that should be available for anyone to use. So I agree the communications and the really spreading the knowledge around this is a key part of that. So thanks for that. We haven't really done that outreach, but I think that's a really good one.
Excellent. So for our next speaker, we have Justin Colligan from Sonoma Tech. Google's been working with Sonoma Tech for probably close to 8-9 years, easily, give or take, in that area. And another fun fact about Justin is, in addition to all the particulate matter you inhale from air quality, he's into pottery. So I don't know if it's same mask, different masks, or no particulate issues.
Same mask, yeah. I would use both. Yeah, and I was definitely a great pottery throwdown, insert, from a pandemic binge watching. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Geo4Good for the opportunity to talk today. My name is Justin Coughlin. I work for Sonoma Technology as an air quality data scientist. And today I'm excited to talk to you about an air quality forecasting tool that we're developing with a number of partners in Google Earth Engine using various data fusion approaches. So as was mentioned in the last talk, it's been a pretty rough year here in the US as it relates to particulate matter from the Canadian wildfires. This year, Canada has had its worst wildfire season on record over the last 40 years. I believe that's 6 times higher than the typical wildfire acreage burn at this point in a given year. A recent study from the Air Quality Life Index based out of the University of Chicago notes that air pollution is the greatest threat to human life expectancy on the planet. And we expect that to continue to get worse as climate change effects continue to become more prevalent. So here in the US, over the last 3 decades, air quality regulations and policies have done a phenomenal job at decreasing the air pollution. We've seen great reductions in nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and fine dust particles, or what's called PM2.5. A recent study, though, has found in the last 7 years, 25 to 50% of that air quality progress has been erased solely due to the wildfire impacts that we're seeing. In addition, the United Nations Environmental Program is projecting that the number of wildfires is expected to increase by up to 30% by the year 2050, which will obviously result in higher concentrations of fine dust particles. Aside from the wildfire impacts, we expect to see increasing fine dust particle concentrations as a result of increasing aridity. One study has noted that fine dust particles could increase by as much as 57% in the southwestern US, which is an arid region of the US, strictly due to that drought stress. So this figure down here on the bottom is showing one of the climate change scenarios, RCP 4.5, and those incremental increases we expect to see in the fine dust particle concentrations by year. Aside from climate change impacts to air quality, we also know that air quality impacts tend to disproportionately impact overburdened communities. The WHO finds that 99% of the global population lives in areas that currently do not meet the World Health Organization's air quality guidelines. In addition to that, they also find that 4.2 million premature deaths occur annually, strictly due to the air pollution outside. That doesn't include any indoor air pollution. And 89% of these premature deaths occur in low and middle income countries where air quality regulations may be less stringent or they may not have air monitoring networks densely across a given area. So this leads me to air quality forecasting. Given those considerations for both climate change as well as the disproportionate impacts, there's currently a need to get better localized air quality forecasting. And while air quality forecasting has been around for decades, with the increasing number of data sources, we're able to get finer spatial resolution as well as higher accuracy in our air quality predictions. In addition to that, data fusion approaches are starting to become more prevalent in these approaches. For example, a recent paper in 2021 by Mallings et al. Demonstrated this capability by using a measurement model satellite fusion approach to forecast nitrogen dioxide concentrations in 5 US cities. So that's what this figure is showing here, is kind of this stepwise process of the data fusion approach where they pull in ground measurements, the NASA GeoCF forecasting model, the Tripome satellite data, and the end result is a hourly forecast once all of these data sources are fused together. So we're working with the authors of that Mallings et al. Paper to build an air quality forecasting system for nitrogen dioxide as well as PM2.5. This is going to use a data fusion approach across models, satellites, as well as ground monitors. Currently, we're working with, in Google Earth Engine, pulling the NASA GeoCF forecast model, as well as the Triplomi satellite data. And then outside of that, we're tapping into a slew of different API sources, some of them being regulatory monitors. So these are kind of your state agency run air monitoring. So kind of the traditional sense of air quality monitoring that occurs on the ground, as well as low-cost sensors, which, if you're unfamiliar, low-cost sensors tend to have lower accuracy, lower precision. So there's a lot more quality assurance that needs to go into these types of things. So we pull all 4 of these data sources and are able to perform our data fusion, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, to generate near-term forecasts for local and national air quality agencies so they can begin to implement that forecast into their decision-making efforts. Currently, we're working with the city of Rio de Janeiro, the city of Dakar, as well as US EPA with 4 partner cities, as well as 4 different state agencies. Each one of these stakeholders has their own intended outcome. So for example, the city of Rio de Janeiro is interested in developing advanced air quality alert days for their residents based on these forecasts. The city of Dakar is interested in kind of looking at their policy implementation. So they've rolled out a variety of vehicular policies that are targeted at reducing air pollution from vehicles. And so they want to use these forecasts to see how well those policies, what sort of gains they're getting out of those vehicle policies. And then lastly, US EPA is interested in seeing if they can get better predictions for air quality with the incorporation of this low-cost sensor data. They haven't really begun to pull that low-cost sensor data into their forecasts, so they're really interested in whether they can get better predictions out of it. So currently, we are developing a tool, which this is a snapshot of. This is showing the Rio de Janeiro area. This is a forecast in late September, I believe, for roughly peak traffic time in the morning. Those black dots are showing kind of the sparsity of the different ground measurements that you have in Rio de Janeiro. What we are doing is generating up to a 5-day forecast for both nitrogen dioxide as well as PM 2.5, notably in areas such as this where there may be few ground monitors. We'll also have a variety of different domains. So you'll be able to select different domains. Notably, if you hop over to Denver, that's a really dense area, both with kind of the regulatory monitoring that goes on there, but also kind of the advent of the low-cost sensors. A lot of folks out there are concerned about wildfires, and you can buy a $250 sensor to know what your localized air quality is. So we're pulling all of that data in. You'll also be able to see the different types of forecasts, which will make more sense on the next slide, as well as it'll have the ability to click on any location within a given domain, and it'll tell you what the projected air quality is going to be at that exact given location. So, if one of you have a house in Rio de Janeiro, you could pinpoint it and see what the air quality was going to be like for almost the next week. So I mentioned that we're also interested in assessing fusion uncertainty. Notably, this is for EPA, but just for us to be able to be transparent about what the uncertainty is in these given forecasts. So here I'm showing a time series from San Francisco for nitrogen dioxide. And what this shows is kind of the different phases of the data fusion process. So first we start off with just the model, the GeoCF model. We pull in the Triplomi satellite data. Within the 3rd phase, we start to incorporate that ground data. And then within the 4th phase, we do some spatial interpolation approaches with that ground measurement data. And you can see as you move along, the bands are showing kind of the uncertainty that's with each one of those phases. And what this really shows is that once you start to pull in those ground measurements, you start to reduce your uncertainty quite a lot. We factor these in by doing calibration periods, and that's kind of how we begin to pull in that ground measurement data. So next steps. So right now we're finalizing our data fusion processes as well as assessing our uncertainties through a variety of different approaches. One of the, as I mentioned, outcomes of this project is to make these tools and forecasts available for our stakeholders. This will allow some of them to incorporate these forecasts into their current processes. So I'm showing Air Now here, that's EPA's forecasting tool, and they're interested in seeing with the injection of these types of forecasts whether they can get better predictions of air quality forecasts in the given domains that we'll be looking at. And then lastly, we're also assessing other data sources that could enhance our forecasting capabilities. For example, we'll be using the VEERS data set, and we're also really interested in the Tempo data set. Once that starts to roll out sometime next spring, I think that's going to be really powerful for trying to do this type of effort. Because obviously we're strictly based just to that overpass on Tripomi at the moment. So here's the list of our project team, ranges across industry, academics, as well as government. Number of folks from Sonoma Technology, NASA GMAO, Morgan State University, EPA, UNEP, Washington University in St. Louis, Columbia University, and Clarity. My contact information is up there if you'd like to reach out. And at this point, I'll take any questions. Thanks so much for your attention.
Anyone? Slide for the next one, maybe. Going once, going twice. All right, we'll move on for time's sake then. Eric, set to go. So Google and WRI have been together for as long as I can remember. We easily have 10 plus years on that relationship. So it's exciting to see these keep growing. And for a fun random fact about Eric, since we're talking about other pandemic things that seem to be coming out, I hear there's a large collection of vinyl records, well over 300. That started during the pandemic. And what genres were that?
Everything.
You just went to yard sales and bought whatever was available?
Yeah, it looked interesting and it was cheap, yeah.
Okay.
No, but something like that. Good afternoon, hi all. Yeah, so WRI and Google have been working together for a long time, but I'm going to be talking about something that's almost completely new. This work on data for cool cities is a new initiative. Partnership between WRI, Google.org, and Google Research, the health team. And it's focused on data for cool cities. So urban heat's a big problem. In this project, we're going to be focusing on filling data gaps, meeting information needs of decision makers, and expanding solution adoption. And I'm going to walk through some of the pieces of that and basically the questions at this point that we're still asking to explore what solutions are most relevant to decision makers. For the context, probably most of you saw in the news that we've been hitting record months for months in a row, and then news was recently released that this is a record season. Summer 2023 was the Earth's hottest in recorded history, and that heat hazard is continuing to grow. So yes, climate change means hotter places more frequently, but not only that, but as Timon referenced, impacts are most severe in cities, and impacts on health are an extremely large part of what we're talking about here when we're talking about extreme heat. So annual heat-related deaths are expected to increase significantly by 2050, a large concentration of that in Asia, South, Southeast, and East Asia. And it's not just because people are concentrated in cities, but there's also physics to this, right? The urban heat island effect. And that means that cities actually heat up more than their surrounding regions. But there are solutions to this. And one of the really important set of solutions is a local one or a regional one around urban infrastructure. What sort of choices we make about how we build our cities with green or built infrastructure, there are a lot of interventions that can make a difference. And there's a variety of familiarity with these solutions, and but a much growing understanding of the impact of these and the science behind how they can actually cool our cities. But right now, the big challenge that we found is that there are barriers to action in terms of implementation. So there's lack of knowledge, among other things. In our early research among decision makers and our user research for potential users of data and tools, top identified barriers so far are actually around prioritizing and identifying actions. What can be done? Where should it happen? And how do we know it's going to make an impact? Political will, obviously making the case for this and getting the funding along to go with it. And then technical implementation, how do we get it done? So we're actually really pleased to find, and this was our hypothesis, that there is a huge element of data and information that can make action and drop some of these barriers for action by urban decision makers. So our project, Data for Cool Cities, is really around this idea that building data and applications can actually meet urban needs around taking action on heat in cities. So open data is an important element of this, and not just providing the data, but actually understanding the specific data needs for specific applications in specific places. And then scaling through communities of practice if we know we have solutions that are having an impact on the ground. So open filling data gaps. What does that mean? Open data that's relevant to specific user questions. So some of the categories of data that we're working with and exploring specific needs and specifications around urban infrastructure, some of those categories of implementation I mentioned before, and then just kind of a baseline understanding of urban morphology and other inputs. Air temperature and heat indices. A lot of work on urban heat islands focus on land surface temperature because it's easy to do. But that's really not a really good proxy of how people understand heat and the heat hazard on human health. So we're working to go beyond that and developing models and other methods of collecting air temperature at fine spatial resolution. Understanding the interactions between infrastructure and heat that are actually going to enable us to look at scenarios and eventually to be able to measure and verify the impact of infrastructure interventions. And then, of course, what do these things cost? And how do we know that the benefits are happening? What do those look like? So a couple of examples on just the data side. This is a product from another WRI team. John Brandt, who's led on this, is here this week. And this is a global data set called Tropical Tree Cover. And it is a global data set for the tropics, Sentinel-based, 10-meter. And it is actually really useful for, I think, probably the best open product to be able to understand tree cover at medium or high resolution for urban relevant applications. So this is on the right is Mexico City, and looking at some snapshots of the variance in tree cover in different neighborhoods of the city. Tree cover and vegetation, tree cover in particular, is a really big influence on people's experience of heat. Shade and evapotranspiration are big contributors in that space, and it varies so significantly across our city. So as others have mentioned, equity is a really important element of this, and understanding how some people have access to infrastructure that protects them from heat and others don't. I mentioned air temperature, thinking about and beginning to build models that are fusing data from different sources. Ground sensors, similar to in the air quality narrative, the network density is not very strong. There are growing adoption of crowdsourced, low-cost citizen science sensors that are being able to provide, data with at least more density of information that's really helpful for training these models if we want to understand how air temperature and humidity and other inputs to understanding the human experience of heat, how they vary spatially across cities and how they relate to our infrastructure. Okay, so part 2, meeting information needs of decision makers. And this is an area that we're actively exploring with cities from various city networks who are in this space. What questions are they most urgently needing to answer? There's a whole slew of them. Here's some examples. Everything from baselining to scenario planning, cost-benefit analysis. And we are going to be working on probably a few of these. I want to give some examples of some of the explorations we're beginning on this topic. So baselining, very simple, but information that's missing in much of the world. And WRI is a global institution and really trying to assess these needs from the perspective of meeting the broad swath of the market, not just the market leaders, in terms of data into action within urban decision makers. And beginning to think about just bringing transparency to these variations. We talked about tree cover. Here's an example that has some similarity, but looking at tree cover across different land use categories. This is from a high resolution fused land use data set that we've built to be relevant to land cover and land use types that are decision maker relevant in heat. So thinking about streets and roads as one of those important categories. Also parking, which you can't find in a lot of those data sets. Just looking at, within a portion of the city of New Orleans, huge variation across districts of the city, right? A 20-point difference in the tree cover along streets and roads, which has a huge impact on how people experience heat in public spaces. What can be done about that? How can we bring transparency to that? And then planning and action and strategies that cities can support and investment related to it. One more, the cost-benefit tool from the Smart Surfaces Coalition. This is actually looking at the numbers behind it. How do you make the economic case? This is a partner of WRI, and we're doing some work with them to kind of spatialize this understanding and prioritizing where you may make investments and what the return on investments would look like. Finally, the last piece of this is around expanding solution adoption. Information can change how decision-making happens, and particularly important is investment in budgets. So there's two elements of that we're focused on. One is around deploying these tools and learning through these city networks. Peer learning among them, also providing user success support in using these tools, and a feedback process of learning and integrating the needs of users from these three different coalitions. And then finally, this is kind of the holy grail and the long-term picture. And I'd love to connect with all of you on any of these themes. And this one in particular is around finance and insurance and how we think about translating risk into opening up the flows of investment. And everything that we've seen and our hope for this project is that being able to provide easy measurement and verification of the impact of interventions on heat is going to be an essential thing to being able to have any sort of financial markets at scale on this. There needs to be a trusted method and something that can be scaled at low cost to reduce transaction costs. Environmental impact bonds being one example. So I'll leave it there, and just wanted to have this as an invitation to a conversation. WRI is actively scoping out all of these three elements. Would love your ideas on what's needed in the data space, application space, and how we scale through partnerships. Please come talk with me, and I'm happy to continue the conversation.
With that, I want to encourage you to find the speakers if you have any follow-ups and questions afterwards. But for the sake of time, I want to give you your full piece. So give me one more click on that. Hand it off. So next we welcome up Miriam Marler from UCLA. And in my brief conversation with her, I learned two things. One, she's an avid baker. She really likes was it strawberry rhubarb pie?
Yeah.
But you got to be careful. Make sure you get enough strawberries in. Otherwise, it's very tart.
There's
And
important facts, yeah.
Yeah. And then we also both learned that the hawk-billed turtle is no longer extinct. And this is a very exciting thing that someone else at GEO4Good found and spread the word.
Yeah, so I will not be talking about turtles today at all. I wish I had known you were going to say that, and I would just put in some photos there. But thanks for having me here today. My name is Miriam Marlier. I'm at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. And this has been a really great session so far, and it actually, the discussion about air pollution and climate hazards and heat actually sets up my talk really nicely. So Brian, great job with the ordering. So today I'm going to be talking about climate hazards here in California. And in particular, I want to share some of the work that we're doing to look at this through a public health lens. So climate hazards are increasing in frequency and severity and persistence in many locations around the world. And here in California, depending on where you're located, this could range from direct threats of wildfires to people and their communities, the long-ranging air pollution impacts from wildfires, extreme heat, drought conditions on our coastal regions. We think about sea level rise, and more. But a critical factor here, and some of the talks today have already talked on about this as well, is that climate hazards are also sometimes linked in space and time. So I'm going to use a term today, compound climate hazards, and this looks at climate hazards that are linked in space and time, and critically from that public health perspective, there's research that shows that there may be more severe impacts when you are exposed to multiple climate hazards at the same time than individual climate hazards. And today, with my focus on California, though I'd love to chat with anyone about ideas as we look to move this research outside of California, I'm going to focus on our interests in wildfire-contributed air pollution, which for simplicity I'll refer to as smoke PM 2.5, so those fine particles contributed by wildfire smoke, and extreme heat. And some emerging research has been showing that if we calculate the potential health effects of exposure to smoke PM 2.5 or heat alone versus considering those factors together, there's a synergistic adverse impacts on health. So it's really important to think about how all of these exposures are working together. And another point that I really want to emphasize here too is that it's important to remember that these climate exposures are not equally distributed among our communities in California. So certain communities will be more vulnerable due to exposure patterns, underlying sensitivities, as well as the ability to adapt to exposure to these hazards. So how big of a problem is this? I have here a graph from a paper that we published last year that used Earth Engine to map exposure to extreme heat and to wildfire smoke PM 2.5 in California. And we focused in this study just on 2020. That was a really extreme wildfire season. If you were here in California, you experienced that firsthand, nearly regardless of where you were in the state. And many of other people you probably saw in the news. So what we looked at here is in Earth Engine, we mapped exposure to extreme heat, which you see in those orange bars, wildfire smoke, which is shown in green, and then really the focus of my talk today is thinking about the intersection between those two, and it's that area in blue. So again, we're really interested in that area from a public health perspective and mapping who is exposed to these compound exposures and what can we do about it. And so that brings me to the goal of the project that we're working on now. Climate hazards do not occur in isolation. I think many of us know this intuitively, but often they are studied separately. And the key questions that we're asking in our study is who is exposed, what are they exposed to, when does it happen, and what can we do about it? So I'm going to walk you through our basic approach for how we conduct this analysis. It's really leveraging the computational resources in Earth Engine. And in Earth Engine, we can work with climate and other exposure-related data sets, as well as population and vulnerability characteristic data to start to look at those outcomes. So our first step is to look at exposures. So we are looking over a 15-year time period at every day, looking at wildfire smoke pollution and extreme heat. And this is based on a combination of remote sensing data and atmospheric modeling and ground stations. Next, to translate this into the public health realm, we look at different definitions of extremes. So we're estimating single or multi-day exposures to heat alone or to smoke alone or to combined, and then also thinking about persistent events, so a heat wave or a heat and smoke wave. And in our third step, then we loop in population data. So we're looking at various community characteristics data that we have across the state of California, as well as local health data that we have too regarding various disease outcomes, as well as hospital emergency room visits. And before I get into our results, I want to give you a sense of what this looks like when we're working in Earth Engine. So on the left, I have an example image from going back to 2020, that extreme fire year. This is one day in September. So you can see that wildfire smoke was covering a large swath of the state. But what we don't know from that satellite image is where was the smoke in the atmosphere? And what was exposure like at the surface? Because that's what's going to be relevant for public health outcomes. So in the next two figures, I have examples from our heat data. So we look at heat index, which is a combination of temperature and relative humidity. And that's more relevant to how hot it feels outside and for various health outcomes. And then surface level smoke PM 2.5. And this is based on a data set from another research group that we were able to import into Earth Engine. And they use a statistical approach based on remote sensing data and ground station data and meteorological variables to back out the contribution of smoke from other sources of pollution like traffic or industry. So now let's get a little bit into our results. So this is showing over our 15-year period from 2006 to 2020, exposures to heat alone, smoke alone, and smoke and heat. And you'll notice here that the units are in terms of days. And what we've done is we've looked at defining exposures relative to extreme thresholds. And this is coming from the public health literature for how to define extreme events. And so we see, especially when you're looking at the compound exposures, that it's communities that are in Northern California, Central California, and parts of the coast that are highly exposed to those extremes. But it's not constant from year to year. So now what I'm showing here is over our 15-year time period, looking at mapping those compound exposures over time. And also, as I mentioned earlier, we look both at single-day exposures as well as more persistent events. So this is showing events that lasted at least 2 days, sometimes more, and how that varies over time. And you'll see that there's a lot of variability, and that's going to matter a lot when we're linking up to who's exposed and what that means for health. What we're currently working on now is linking with our health outcome data. So I just have some preliminary work here. And this is showing overlaying population data in California with our compound exposure data sets. So when we're working at a smaller census tract scale, we see that more of the impacts are in Northern California. But when we zoom out to the county scale and we're overlapping our compound exposures, we see that even if there's more moderate exposures in some densely populated counties like down in LA or up here in the Bay Area, there's a lot of people who are exposed. So to wrap up, we learned a few things. So first, there's a lot of variability in both individual and compound exposures. But we did identify certain areas in the state that are repeatedly exposed to these compound events. And one of the key points with working in Earth Engine is that we have the flexibility to explore different exposure data sets and different definitions of extremes. And so that's been really useful from a computational standpoint as we're linking up with our health outcome data. So as I mentioned, what we're working on now is using our combined exposures to guide public health interventions. How do you change your guidance if you're exposed to only heat or only smoke, or if you're exposed to both? And we're also going to be building out a Google Earth Engine app to be able to share our results. So thank you for having me here today. And if there's time, I'm happy to answer some questions.
All right, and our final speaker is Mac Fredericks. And one of the fun things I learned about him is he enjoys pheasant, right, struggling with the word, pheasant hunting for some reason. But we found this out by talking about dogs for a while.
Yeah, I've got a golden retriever dog named Howie. Maybe next time I'll bring him here. he gets along with tigers really well. So, hi everyone. My name is Mac Friedrichs. It's a pleasure to be here today and speak with you. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about evapotranspiration modeling for national water use mapping. I work as a contractor with the U.S. Geological Survey, the Earth Resources Observation and Science Center in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So, question for you: who here has been to the AROS Data Center, the USGS AROS Center? A couple of you. Who has heard of the USGS AROS Data Center? All right. And lastly, who uses Landsat here? Okay, good. So, USGS AROS is the home of the Landsat archive, and they receive, downlink all the satellite data and then make it publicly available, and make all these beautiful images here, like you see. And then thank you very much to Google to making all of this data, the Landsat data, available to all of you beautiful people and the people here at Geo4Good and the greater remote sensing community. So our team consists of a number of USGS staff, some AROS contractors, and then the Desert Research Institute partners, and have been really pivotal to the work that we do with remote sensing ET. And what we do specifically is to model and distribute ET of croplands and other areas in the landscape using remote sensing data. We perform national and global crop water use analysis with both climate data, weather data, and ET information, and create this data available to the public for water availability applications. And why accurate ET data is important. If you attended Robin Grimm's keynote last night on OpenET, she discussed some of the pressing water demands and water crises that we experience in the Western U.S., but also around the globe. We know how important it is to be able to quantify and understand the amount of water we have so we can make proper management decisions. ET is the second largest component of the water cycle after precipitation. It's used to approximate the amount of water that's been consumed by the landscape and then returned up to the atmosphere. And it's needed to make management decisions at various scales. As the saying goes, you can't manage what you don't measure. Our work, we use remote sensing data, specifically the Landsat thermal capabilities, to create like a thermal indexing approach with the simplified surface energy balance model. And it takes advantage of various weather and climate information and uses kind of a satellite psychrometry ET approach. One of our key products here that we produce is nationwide Landsat ET at 30-meter resolution, and we produce these products for various state and federal partners, and it's a major input to the USGS National Hydrologic Model. And this information is helpful for national scale water accounting information, and we are currently working on a data release to make available the last 20 years of monthly and annual ET composites for the nation, and you can find more information at the manuscript there and our open source code in the link there. And so Earth Engine has been a big piece of this for us to be able to scale up our model and the work that we do to process these hundreds of thousands of images and create these value-added ET products. So as part of that, one of the goals of the National Hydrologic Model is to take advantage of these new tools and capabilities and the data to modernize national assessment inventories. Previously, USGS was operating on like a 5-year cycle to compile all these report estimates and make kind of a national water census estimate. And then it was a very time-consuming, arduous process. And moving forward, the hope is to create a higher frequency return on that and to have a more consistent approach. And so one way is to adopt these well-established methods and models, not just with ET, but also for irrigation layers and other information from remote sensing and taking advantage of the high-performance computing that the cloud offers. And also, a side benefit of this is to definitely build a clear picture for the future. And as I said, to provide a more frequent reporting framework and deliver a more frequent synthesis and interpretation of the data so that we can create a better water use compilation and information accumulation process. And so doing some investigative research with this remote sensing ET allows us to kind of evaluate the inputs and also then to be able to get a more rapid return in the reporting process. So an example of applying this ET information within irrigation studies for coupling ET to a national hydrologic model. This is something that is currently in progress, but we looked at nationwide irrigated lands and quantifying the amount of ET as well as precipitation and displaying that for a nationwide trend from the last 20 years or so. And what we see is over the last 20 years, consistent increase in actual evapotranspiration as well as effective precipitation, which is consistent with increases in actual ET and consumptive use, which is consistent with trends in precipitation and also consistent with different changes in climate and climate variability. So one interesting thing here in the year 2012 was a really large national drought. We actually had the highest increase in ET, about 50% increase in water use nationwide relative to the increases in positive precipitation in other years. So taking advantage of these tools and these data, the USGS is planning an operational OpenET program that collaborates in partnership with the OpenET consortium to provide better baseline ET summaries and consistent evaluation of these ET products. We are collaborating to help develop the OpenET software system, as well as create a quicker return on the ET products in a more timely fashion, and then continuing to evaluate both climate inputs into these ET models to make sure that they're most effective and deliver the best available science. An example here in Arizona as far as integrated science approaches is around Phoenix there's these competing interests for water use as far as the irrigated lands and urban development. What you can see here is between 2010 and 2017, the conversion of both urban areas into agriculture, as well as conversion from a reduction of urbanization and increase in agricultural lands. And so the amount of water that's used in Arizona, 74% of the water supply, is actually decreasing because of investments in improving the efficiency of irrigation delivery. And so you can see, just for reference there, about 85 to 90% water use efficiency in these center pivots. But likewise, in various orchards in the area for flood irrigated pecans, they are working on doing some conversion to sprinkler irrigation systems, which are much more efficient and can take advantage of, that efficiency in design for water delivery. And so looking at ET is helpful as far as being able to evaluate those impacts and quantify the consumptive use differences. Another illustration here that's very timely is an example of the terrible drought we had in California last year in 2022. It was around the Sacramento area, just north of here. Over 80% of the water cuts for many rice farmers. And so using the OpenET tool is here to just visualize this. On the left, you can see in 2021, an average year as far as water consumption and farmers applying waters to their fields. And then on the right, you can see the obvious drought impacts and the field fallowing there. And on the plot on the bottom, it's a 24-month timeline on the x-axis. You can see the different rates there. And so the tools like OpenET and the remote sensing products that we've created are able to help us kind of quantify and visualize that change and see its impacts. And another thing that I want to share is the USGS at AROS is working on producing some global ET estimates with the MODIS and VIIRS data set. And this is taking advantage of our updated model algorithms and presenting cloud availability for this data within the Earth Engine data catalog. It's available in Climate Engine, in the community catalog. And this type of information is supporting the Famine and Early Warning Systems Network, as well as USAID to help with food security, drought monitoring, crop value chains, and a lot of studies in that regard. So feel free to take advantage of this data and check it out. And with that, thank you for your time.
All right, so we're just on time. If anyone has a question, I'd encourage you to come find the speaker now and figure out anything else that might fit your interest. Other than that, I think we're on to the next sessions. So thank you so much for all the great speakers.